from West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
Support for the Legislature Today is provided by the following.
West Virginia University, online at wvu.edu. The High Technology Foundation, headquartered at the I-79 Technology Park in Fairmont, online at wvhtf.org.
At the legislature today, the Senate voted to override the governor's veto of the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act. The law to restrict abortion after 22 weeks goes into effect in 90 days. An informal joint session of the legislature was held in the House chamber today as emergency management officials brief lawmakers about the impact of this week's storms, and will review just how historic this legislative session is on the legislature today. Good evening, I'm Ashton Mara. There was great disagreement about Senate Bill 423 at a public hearing this morning. The measure amends the Above Ground Storage Tank Act passed by the legislature last year after the Kanawha Valley water crisis. As Beth Voorhees reports, industry representatives applauded the bill, while environmentalists told members of the House Judiciary Committee to leave the current law alone.
Rebecca Randolph, president of the West Virginia Manufacturers Association, is sure that Senate Bill 423 will protect drinking water.
Senate Bill 423 adopts the concept of zones of critical concern as developed in the House of Delegates last year and adds additional protection through the addition of zones of peripheral concern. As was intended, this new iteration of the legislation works to focus the efforts of the DEP on tanks that present the most risk to public drinking water supplies.
But Paul Sheridan of Advocates for a Safe Water System isn't as sure.
Senate Bill 423 is not a fix to something that is broken. 373 was good legislation, as others have mentioned. It was a compromise bill. It went through many committees, and there was a long process that went into it. It has not had a chance to work.
Doug Douglas works for a family-owned oil and gas producer. He says his tanks are already heavily regulated and don't need any more government oversight.
One of the major misconceptions, I think, that came about when the legislation passed last year that still may apply is that oil and gas tanks are not regulated. But the fact is that since 1973 under the EPA, there's been spill prevention, control, and countermeasure programs that have been in place. So the purpose of this bill and last year's legislation to protect the waters is already in place with programs that oil and gas producers have to follow.
But Tim Sayre was angry. He asked members of the committee if they even remember last year when a coal cleaning chemical leaked into the Elk River in Charleston, contaminating drinking water for 300,000 West Virginians in 9 counties.
It was a mess, but we pulled together and we got through. We also passed a law that would help make sure it doesn't happen again. And now you want to gut this law and exempt over 36,000 tanks. This is unacceptable. I will not allow it. And like it or not, you work for me.
That event led to the passage of Senate Bill 373 to regulate above-ground storage tanks, the very bill Senate Bill 423 seeks to alter. Jan Vineyard of the Oil Marketers and Grocers Association reassured lawmakers that Senate Bill 423 would adequately protect the water supply.
This bill protects the environment and will allow DEP to focus on the tanks that have the biggest threat to our drinking water. As the bill passed last year, DEP would be spread so thin that they would not be able to spend the time on those that do have the threat. It also placed further regulations on tanks that were already regulated.
But Maya Nye, with people concerned about chemical safety, says otherwise.
I know 14 people who specifically left this area, them and their children, middle-aged, tax-paying citizens who left specifically because of the water crisis. So I would just ask you to take these things into consideration and to take into consideration that the Freedom tanks wouldn't even be regulated under this bill.
Senate Bill 423 passed the Senate overwhelmingly, 30-1. It will now be considered by the House Judiciary Committee before the full House puts it up to a vote. For West Virginia Public Broadcasting, I'm Beth Voorhees.
As the session dwindles, things are picking up in the Chamber's respective finance committees as the chairman and their staffs work to finalize the 2016 budget for presentation to the members next week. In the Senate, the chair says his budget proposal is almost ready for next year, but today he asked members to vote on bills that will ensure the current year's budget will be balanced. But first, senators put to a vote a bill the governor says is unconstitutional.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that in accordance with Section 14, Article 7 of the Constitution of the State of West Virginia, that the Senate proceed to consider enrolled committee substitute for House Bill 2568.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch Carmichael moved the Senate reconsider the pain-capable Unborn Child Protection Act after its veto this week by Governor Earl Ray Tomblin. The bill creates a 22-week abortion ban in West Virginia, something the governor says is unconstitutional. Members of the House voted earlier this week to override the veto, and senators today concurred.
On this question, 27 yeas, 5 nays, 2 absent and not voting. More than a majority of those elected to the Senate have been voted in the affirmative. I declare the bill passed, notwithstanding the objections of the governor.
The pain-capable Unborn Child Protection Act will become law in 90 days. Members voted on and approved 4 other bills on third reading today, all supplemental appropriations proposed by the governor to help balance the 2015 budget. The budget year ends in July. Senate Finance Chair Mike Hall.
We're in 2015, and the money is going to be about $80 million short. The money projected is not here, although it's getting a little better. So what you saw today were bills that basically in one way or another fill the gap of this year's budget.
The bills move excess funds from last year's budget to the state accounts that pay for Medicaid and Medicaid services. The expenses this year and in years past have been substantially more than projected. Hall says, as he understands, the Medicaid accounts contain millions upon millions of state dollars and are often borrowed from to cover shortfalls in other areas.
The Medicaid line ends up being a line that I've understood that there's a lot of money there. It's multi-millions, and when you're doing 20 million or so forth, you're barely scratching the percentage surface of it, so that it's more flexible, that you can move money in and out of it as those expenditures are not always being tapped by the providers. So it has become a place where you can take money and then restore money in order to deal with these deficits.
Approving supplemental bills for the current year is nothing new for lawmakers. Hall says while legislators do their best to provide a viable budget for the next fiscal year, revenues and expenditures are constantly changing, and the legislature or the governor has to go back and fill in the gaps.
The governor can change the budget projections throughout the year. Our budget document is a solid document, but it is a document that can be amended and changed. And every year, if you'll look back, you'll see the current year's budget was changed by these types of supplemental actions, reflecting either a surplus that was spent, or in this case, a deficit where you need to grab money from somewhere to fill the gap.
As for the upcoming 2016 budget, Hall says he is prepared to present his proposal to lawmakers next week, but doesn't expect a final vote on the budget bill during the regular session.
The full bodies are doing things, not just the chairman, that may bring some disagreement. And we know that we probably will press on into the first 2 or 3 days of the week after the end of this session, just to technically pull all these things together.
Hall says lawmakers will continue to pass bills through the final day of the session next Saturday that will ultimately affect the state's bottom line, and expects to have a better handle on the final budget and the specific areas of conflict between the House and Senate after the March 14th deadline. Coming up, remember the campaign phrase 83 is enough? It was used effectively by the Republican Party to win control of the legislature. A former State House reporter joins us to detail his latest article on the historic nature of this legislative session. But first, here's a look at what's coming up in the Senate and the House.
Up for passage in the Senate, House Bill 2755 to address seniority and other personnel issues relating to service and professional employee positions at jointly established schools. These schools are operated by 2 county boards of education. Among the bills on second reading, House Bill 2462, reducing the amount of sales tax proceeds annually dedicated to the School Major Improvement Fund by $2 million for the fiscal year 2016, and reducing the amount of sales tax proceeds annually dedicated to the School Construction Fund by $6 million for the fiscal year 2016. This is Governor Tomlin's bill to help balance the state budget for next fiscal year. House Bill 2527 to create a task force on the prevention of sexual abuse of children. The task force is to develop recommendations and proposals for statutory changes, state education policy, and methods to foster cooperation among state agencies, local government, schools, and communities to prevent child sexual abuse. House Bill 2535 to expand the number of people who are trained in suicide prevention in order to maximize the possibility that at-risk children and adults can be saved. School personnel from middle school through college will not only be trained, they will provide children and young adults with suicide prevention information, facilitate discussion about preventing suicide, and make mental health resources available. House Bill 2550, increasing the number of unexcused student absences during a school year from 5 to 10 before an attendance director or assistant shall make complaint against a parent, guardian, or custodian before a magistrate. Among the bills on second reading in the House, Senate Bill 277, providing for a certificate of birth for a stillborn child, and Senate Bill 421, providing for limitations on punitive damages in civil actions.
As we get ever closer to the end of this legislative session, we are reminded just how historic it really is. Republicans have taken the helm for the first time since the Gold Dome was erected in Charleston and are continuing to work their way through a jam-packed agenda. Here this evening to discuss his cover story on the change in power is Zach Harold, managing editor for the New South Media magazine West Virginia Focus. His article is titled The Flip. Zach, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me here.
We should say this article is available right now at wvfocus.com if people want to go and see it. But let's start with the history behind this flip. You say the Democrats have not always had power in West Virginia. They came in on the heels of FDR.
Well, when West Virginia was first made a state, the Republicans were the majority party. They lost that status in the 1870s, regained it, and then it wasn't until FDR came in that we saw Democrats come back as the majority party in West Virginia. The
interesting thing in this story was that the majority, you say the majority party always gets the blame.
I didn't say that. Billy Joe Payton, a historian at West Virginia State University, said that. But yeah, that's true. The coal market in West Virginia was having some trouble at the time. West Virginia slipped into economic despair a little ahead of the Great Depression. And the Republicans were the majority party at the time, so the voters went looking for change, so they found it in what FDR was promising with a New Deal. So.
And we're seeing similarities today, though, where at the federal level there's dissatisfaction, and that's leaking down to the state level as well.
Again, we have a coal market that's not doing so well, and people are looking for change, and they find it, I guess, in the minority party.
Let's start and talk about the House of Delegates. The state GOP has said for 2 years that the House was going to be their focus. And going into elections in November, they were almost positive that they were going to make that change.
Yeah, Tim Armstead I talked to for this story. He said they were pretty confident that they would be able to flip the House, but then on election night when he was watching the returns come in, I believe at the Embassy Suites, he lost count. And it wasn't until later that he realized how much of a margin they had gained in the House. Yeah, that didn't come as too much of a surprise, but the magnitude of it is what surprised them.
And then in the Senate, we have a totally different situation where the flip
almost no one expected it.
No one expected the count. I think we were in the newsroom scrambling, tried to keep track that evening, as I'm sure you all were as well. But their switch comes on the back of one person, and that's Senator Daniel Hall. You detail in this story what happened the day after Election Day. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's fascinating. What happened was Daniel Hall had originally, years ago, run for a House of Delegates seat as a Republican. He switched to Democrat he says, without intention of running for office again, but then decided to run, and he was elected to the House of Delegates as a Democrat. Then he made a successful campaign to the Senate as a Democrat. And there had always been this conversation he was having with the Republicans, and they were trying to convince him to come back. And he always said, why would I ever come back to the minority party? Well, then there's a tie. He could be the tiebreaker, and they start playing a little bit of, he called it poker, trying to convince him to come back, and he did. He said he did it because he wanted to be able to represent his constituents as a member of the majority party.
So one interesting comment Tim Miley makes in the story is that the relationship between the Democrats and Republicans previously had been one of compromise. This year it's cordial, but there's little compromise between the two parties. And I would venture to say, if I was a Republican member of the House who had been there in the past, that's not how they feel.
It's all about perspective. It's all about perspective. The Democrats are getting a perspective that they didn't have for a long time. Now, I mean, nobody, hardly anyone alive remembers when the Republicans were the majority party in the West Virginia legislature. It's changed a lot of people's perspectives about a lot of things.
At the beginning of this session, you spent a couple days at the Capitol talking to lawmakers, talking to lobbyists. What changes do you see? What sticks out the most to you?
Oh gosh, when I covered, well, everyone's sitting in different seats now. That's different. The legislature, when I covered the legislature for the Charleston Daily Mail, it seemed like the agenda was always backloaded. That's not the right word, but it was. They waited until later into the session to do things, and this time it was front-loaded. There also seems to be this push by the Republicans to get as much done as possible. As you made mention earlier, the agenda has just been jam-packed this year. It's like they've been waiting for years and years and years to have the ability to set the agenda, and now that they do it, they've come out of the gate just running as fast as they can.
I think a lot of us, as we spoke with the new leadership in November after the switch was clear, thought that the big thing was, well, what's the agenda? What do you guys do? What comes next? And Tim Armstead always said, we've been pushing the same agenda for years. This is the same thing that we've always been working on. So it's been interesting to see them actually get those things through.
Yeah, he talked about that a little bit in the piece. He says that, you know, he doesn't try to think about how historic his position is, but sometimes it hits him. And he said it hit him when they were standing on the floor of the House discussing nonpartisan election of judges. And he said he just couldn't believe that he was standing there behind that speaker's desk having that discussion and seeing that bill come up for a vote, something that the Republicans have tried to get for so long.
Well, Zach Harold, your article, The Flip, is in this edition of West Virginia Focus. Yep. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much.
Up next, emergency officials updated lawmakers about this week's heavy rain and snowfalls and conditions throughout the state. But first, here's a look at some of the bills signed by the governor.
Among the bills signed by the governor, Senate Bill 3 relating to liability of possessor of real property for harm to a trespasser. Senate Bill 7 to require instruction in CPR and first aid in public school health education subjects. Senate Bill 13 relating to the liability of a possessor of real property for injuries caused by open and obvious hazards. Senate Bill 237 creating the Captive Cervid Farming Act. Senate Bill 255 eliminating certain boards, councils, committees, panels, task forces, and commissions. Senate Bill 280 allowing well work permit transfers between oil and gas companies. House Bill 2001 repealing portions of the Alternative and Renewable Energy Portfolio Act. House Bill 2002 predicating actions for damages upon principles of comparative fault. House Bill 2004 requiring the legislature to approve the state plan to comply with the Federal Clean Air Act. House Bill 2008 auditing the Division of Highways. House Bill 2025 prohibiting certain sex offenders from loitering within 1,000 feet of a school or child care facility. House Bill 2138 allowing aircraft operations on private airstrips and farms for a recreational purpose. House Bill 2200 recodifying child welfare laws. House Bill 2217 relating to the qualifications of the Commissioner of Labor. House Bill 2234 requiring a court to permit a party in a divorce proceeding to resume using the name he or she used prior to marriage. And House Bill 2669 relating to compulsory tuberculosis testing.
Today, a special joint session of the legislature was held in the House chamber in response to the crisis caused by this week's storm. Officials wanted to explain Governor Tomlin's state of emergency declaration, update lawmakers about current conditions, and tell them what they should tell their constituents affected by the storm. Liz McCormick reports.
Heavy rains began earlier this week that soon turned to heavy snow. Flooding and power outages have been huge problems in many parts of the state, and especially in some southern counties. Peter Markham, general counsel to Governor Earl Ray Tomblin, reminded legislators of some of the different possibilities that could occur during a governor's declared state of emergency. Markham says the governor may decide to evacuate residents, provide temporary housing, declare disaster zones, suspend the sale of alcohol or explosives, and may even close schools.
It's important that you look at each particular state of emergency declaration because each emergency is unique, and the governor, the legislature, the local emergency service providers will be offering specific guidance to deal with the emergency.
Last year, the legislature passed a governor's bill that required a state of preparedness for emergencies in situations like the current winter storm. Peter Markham says this has allowed first responders to act quickly in light of this storm.
Thanks to a governor's bill that this body passed last year, we now have the power to declare a state of preparedness. This enables the governor to exercise all of his emergency powers well in advance of an imminent emergency so that we can marshal resources, put them in place in preparation of problems. It also allows us to warn the public, you need to be on high alert because a severe winter storm is coming.
Major General James A. Hoyer with the West Virginia National Guard says the state of preparedness has helped to get a head start on the crisis.
From the standpoint of my role and our responsibility as the National Guard, what you provided us last year with the state of preparedness, I think it's important to understand the benefit to our ability to respond and to the National Guardsmen. By allowing us to move in early, it allows us to put men and women in place ahead of time that makes the response more effective in the front end, which hopefully reduces the time and the cost on the back end.
This morning in the 20th District in Mingo County, there was a mudslide that left many residents trapped. Delegate Justin Markham says he's very concerned for his constituents in his home district.
I've talked to County Commissioner John Mark Hubbard and Greg Hootie Smith. They're on the ground. We're working now to implement the National Guard. We're trying to bring in other resources. I will praise our county commission. They've done a great job with these in the past and moving forward. We're just praying for these individuals that are trapped with the mudslide. We have around 50 people trapped. We have boats and dozers that will be going in. The issue is with the where it's trapped, the mudslide is coming in, the water is rising. Most places the water's receding, but we got the water's rising here, and that's our main concern. So the evacuation process is ongoing. Luckily, praise God, we have no injuries at this point.
Delegate Lynn Arvon of Raleigh County oversees the 31st District, which has seen a lot of water outages in the last few days. She says her district has been declared a disaster area.
The portion of Route 3 that is in my district, District 31, goes down Route 3 and to the Boone County line, has been declared a disaster area. We now have 2 deployments of the National Guard in that area, and they are able, people who are stuck in their homes and can't get out, the roads have been washed out, or whatever the cause may be, they can call the emergency services number, which I have put on my House of Delegate page, and the National Guard will be sent to get them. They will go on foot and get them or deliver water or whatever needs they have.
After the presentation, Speaker Tim Armstead reminded members as they deal with constituents' troubles related to the storm, have them turn to local sources of assistance rather than going straight to the state to address their needs.
I think it's very important, as my discussions with each of you, is to just reiterate that when you have constituents that do have needs, whatever those needs are, I think we start with that local, rather than try to go up to the state level immediately when they're trying to to get all these things handled from the various counties to go through your county originally is very important.
Governor Tomlin's state of emergency continues with updates as weather and flooding in the state continue to be addressed. For West Virginia Public Broadcasting, I'm Liz McCormick in Charleston.
According to the National Weather Service, no additional major weather is expected this weekend. Although residents will experience very cold mornings, temperatures are predicted to gradually warm up through the weekend, causing snow and ice to slowly melt. For updates on warming stations, shelters, power outages, road closures, and weather conditions, continue to monitor the state's official Facebook page at facebook.com/West Virginia Thor. This has been the Legislature Today. We'll be back on Monday to report from the final week of the first regular session of the 82nd West Virginia Legislature. I'm Ashton Mara. Thanks for joining us. Good night.
Support for the Legislature Today is provided by the following:
West Virginia University, online at wvu.edu. The High Technology Foundation, headquartered at the I-79 Technology Park in Fairmont, online at wvhtf.org.